Can you go over these different types, what they are?
So there are we could run through some of the different names of them. We generally like to start with the body types going 8, 9, and 1, and then the heart types 2, 3s, and 4s, and then the head types 5, 6s, and 7s.
Hi, Chad. How are you doing today?
Hey, Mark, it is great to be here with you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on here. I've been looking forward to speaking to you because your profile, your experience level speaks to me in ways that it has never done before. I see you're a certified Enneagram professional. What does that mean?
It means that I've done a lot of training and learning in a more formal way with some different mentors and master coaches themselves in their own right. Dr. Jerry Wagner of the Spectrum Method. And then later, when I felt that was really that training that he did, he's been in it since I think he created a test in like 1970 for it. So that guy's been around, and it was a lot of head knowledge. It was very psychological, getting some training from him. And then I really did an intensive program and work of a psycho spiritual experience with Beatrice Chestnut and Yaron Pius of the CP Enneagram Academy. And that was a really rigorous training, of which I'm very grateful for. I love their community, and I recommend everyone check both of those programs out. But I really love, the CP Enneagram is something they continue to have retreats and trainings. And I'm going to another one, even though I've long since got the certification, but they have deeper and more advanced training. I'm going to one in this October in California. So that'll be exciting.
Very exciting.
And I guess to finish answering your question a little bit, it also just means that I've been practicing with it in my own life for half a decade actively, and I use it as a coaching tool. I've had mentor coaches use it with me, and I do like to use it with clients. It's not like I can only coach someone if we know their Enneagram type. I just believe that it's a super power. If you want, it can be incredibly and deeply, immediately effective in terms of knowing who you are not in a certain respect. This isn't about labeling people or putting you in a box to categorize you and thinking we know that people are far more complex even than your personality construct. But it is a way of understanding this archetype and this pattern, this box within which you may not be, probably aren't fully conscious or aware of how you do participate in some of the behaviors. And then beyond that, it builds an awareness of beginning to understand what are the motivations behind why it leads to some of the behaviors that it does.
It's a very interesting tool. I've studied a good bit about it. I'm still wanting to learn more, and that's why I'm glad I have an expert like you on here. To my understanding and to the understanding of my audience, essentially there are certain personality types. Is that what the Enneagram lays it out? Can you go over these different types, what they are?
Yeah, it sure does. And on a more surface level, that is the Enneagram of personality, such as we know it, is about 50 years old. Now, the symbol's very ancient, very rich tradition, but the Enneagram of personality and using it as a typology is just about 50 years old, using the latest and all of the psychology that we know from all of the tradition, from Jung and Freud and Adler, and all the amazing women contributors, Margaret Mahler, Karen Horney, Klein, many of, I don't want to forget to mention the women, but yes, so we could run through some of the different names of them. We generally like to start with the body types going 8, 9, and 1, and then the heart types 2, 3s, and 4s, and then the head types 5, 6s, and 7s, even though for some people it might be chronologically less confusing to just go 1 through 9. Happy to do it either way, but I will just say, Mark, if whether or not we need to wheel around what's fascinating about it is that it does seem that there are these 9 archetypes that you can find for thousands of years, as far back as we can go into human behavior, of which people are generally caught up in and mirror the main characteristics of one of these. And it's fascinating that we think, oh, maybe it's endless or what. It seems to be like a limited number and that there are 9. And one of the real entry points to it is when we can do a lot of description outward of and a lot of people, some people might immediately go and see themselves in it and go, oh, okay, wow, that's me. And many, maybe many more at first go, well, I think I hear a lot of myself in a lot of these types. And so when I do trainings and workshops with people, especially to groups where they haven't taken a test, maybe they're not very familiar with it in the first place, which is its own set of challenges, I try to encourage people to try to be more aware of on a lower level, like not super conscious emotional place, how when we talk about the passions of each of these types, how does that register? Because in the end, only you will know what your number is. And the truthful, deep way that you'll recognize it is to see and observe that lower level emotional, no matter whether you're a heart type, head type, or a body type, that lower level emotional core. And so to illustrate a little bit about what that means is if you're an 8, they call that traditionally the challenger, and it's a body type, you're a gut type, and you move into power, you move into action, you don't use a lot of words, you value authenticity, but your passion is what they would call lust. And it mirrors a lot of the 7 deadly sins that we hear that language of. And there is an interesting tradition that it borrows from. But it's not lust in the sexual sense, lust in this powerful way of seeking that one big thing to fill you up. It's a big, powerful energy. And it's not like gluttony in the 7. Gluttony is also a kind of constant needing to get filled up, but it's a seeking what's interesting. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so I don't really know the entry points that you would like to access in this discussion, what would be useful to your audience. But yes, there are these 9. And I think that in the end, whatever book you look at, whatever you might listen to start trying to learn about it, I think in the end, the way that you ultimately do recognize yourself in a truthful way is this emotional way.
So let's talk about the 9 different personality types so that the audience knows what they are to begin in, and then we can deal deep. This part we'll edit out, editors. We're just going to come back into it. So, Chad, tell us a little bit about the 9 different personality types that are outlined by the Enneagram.
Okay, we divide them up. I think it's an easy access point to thinking of them as body or gut types, and then heart types, and then head types. And what that means and how it's already valuable in a coaching capacity is to think that like when we're coaching, when we're observing ourselves, it's good to be able to do somatic practices, right? To be able to access what's going on in the gut, in the body, in your breath. We're 3-brained beings, right? We have the limbic system, the reptilian system. We do have all of these centers of intelligence. But if you're an 8, a 9, or a 1, you tend to be a little bit more in your body. That's how
What
you
mean? Be in your body. What does that mean?
It means that the way that you lead, the way that you interpret reality is not as much you don't filter it first through your emotions. You don't filter it first through your head as relational heart types do or head types. It means you are embodied and you are thrown into a gut intuitive type of reaction. Now, and it's just an entry point to thinking about the 3 types. For body types and gut types, there is a low level unconscious anger that they experience and that they feel more in their guts. And 8s tend to overexpress that anger. 9s tend to underexpress that anger. And 1s are in ambivalence to it, holding it in, trying to do what is right, trying to be, they traditionally were called the perfectionist. So
Can you
8s,
give an example?
yeah.
Yeah, can you give an example of a situation that a gut type person would interpret a certain way as if a
Okay.
head and heart type?
Let's see. Sure. One thing at a time, if I may, because yes, I think we can have endless examples of how this can work. But it's so in that understanding of they have a relationship to anger and there is an overdoing and underdoing and an ambivalence to that immediately can help understand. So if we just say the eight's the challenger, moves into bold action, really doesn't have a lot of subtlety, will powerfully move into action. Whereas the nine, a neighboring style, also a body type, but is almost doing the opposite in some ways. They fall asleep to their anger. They're called the peacemaker, the mediator in a lot of ways. So it doesn't mean that they're lazy to themselves. It just means that they are really, their focus of attention isn't on hard charging and getting it done like the eight. It's almost the opposite in some ways. It is about, I want peace. I don't want to rock the boat. I want to make sure everyone is good. And then the last of the body types, the one is considered traditionally the perfectionist, the one who's like following rules, trying to do everything right, might have a bit of a rigid posture and body language because they're really trying to be good. And on a team, when they're in personality, you want them on a team because they're naturally have high integrity. They follow the rules. They want to do what is right. And what they do is they expect everyone else to be doing what is right and following the rules. And when others aren't, and they're very sensitive to that, then it's often a blind spot, but they might leak out their irritation. And that's what I mean by they're in ambivalence to that underlying anger, where they feel it, they're aware of it, they have a high inner critic. They don't mean to come across as seeming judgmental or, like you're feeling criticized from them. And they're not even always aware of it, but they might be leaking that out a little bit and trying to be good. So those are the body types real quick. Now, if we're going through the twos, threes, and fours and the heart types, their underlying central emotional stance is sadness. And they're all twos, threes, and fours are very image conscious. How are they seen? How are they connecting? And they can read a room really, like they come in and they're immediately like, how am I connecting? Who's connecting with me in different ways? Because just as those body types had different relationships to anger, the heart types have different relationships to this feeling of sadness. It's very sensitive, traditionally called the helper. They're thinking of others first. They are in ambivalence to the sadness. They feel it, but since they're thinking about others and they're trying to be likable and support others, they aren't as in tune. They're pushing that sadness down. Threes, the productive performer, we live in a three culture. They live by their checklist. They have a marketing orientation. They can shape shift to please their audience. They are often Taurians. They are sometimes actors. Sometimes they're great athletes because they're seeking that which the culture idealizes. And so they are underdoing the sadness because sadness is messy, because sadness gets in the way of being productive and getting things done. On the workforce, it's hard to keep up with the threes. And you often hear them saying, oh, I guess I just need to slow down for everybody else. That's the work I need to do on my team. And then finally, fours, they are overdoing the sadness that they feel. They're often considered that the creative, right? The romantic. I try to emphasize that fours can be in any walk of life. They're not just necessarily only creative, but for those fours who often are, why does their personality construct sometimes lead them to being in the arts or wanting to be expressive? It's because they are very sensitive. They're really feeling it. But unlike those twos that are thinking of others first, they're thinking of how do I feel first? They're really interpreting it. They can have these difficult feelings and these special feelings, but they don't really know how to communicate the depth and the intensity of their emotional purview. And so they can only do it in these extraordinary expressions, right? Of being a novelist or a poet or an artist of some kind, a dance expressing that sadness. Now I'm just racing through these numbers because I don't want to bore anybody. We're just giving an overview. So going to 5, 6, and 7, the head types, they're cooler. So you think of the warmth of the heart types. And if you were thinking in these ways, you would think of like heat of the body types. You'd think of coolness for the head types. They lead more with cerebral. How are things working here? Their underlying emotion is fear. So you get a lot of anxiety in 5, 6s, and 7s. You also, interestingly, with the head types, there's a little bit of a subtle rebellion, a rebel in them, because they're always pushing, nudging, thinking of their relationship to authority in their fear. So 5s in their fear, they're very compartmentalized. They're often called the observer. They're the analytical specialist. They're the most introverted of probably all the types of the Enneagram. Although the Enneagram, by the way, doesn't just say like the Myers-Briggs, you're introverted or you're more extroverted. 5s boundary themselves often very emotional. Sometimes it's physical boundaries. They like their den, they like their library, and it's very clear where their boundaries are. Sometimes it's just, hey, I don't really like to be hugged in there. And they give off a vibe of maybe aloofness or stay away a little bit. And what's interesting about 5s that a lot of people may not know is that they are actually highly sensitive. They don't seem like it because they're aloof and distant and highly cerebral and knowledgeable, but they've protected themselves with their knowledge, so that seeking the knowledge is a protective mechanism. And at first, maybe on a workforce team, they're going to be quiet. And then as they build up the knowledge and they feel more comfortable with where they're at, then they may speak at length. So what's interesting about 5s in all of that aloofness, they've got depth. They've got complexity because they do know a lot, because they just love knowledge. Moving on to 6s, they are overdoing fear, projecting it out. They're like the troubleshooter. They can be the squeaky wheel, but they are in help. They're going to be your forecaster. They're going to be able to go, hey, this is what's going on. But in not as health, they are that squeaky wheel. They're irritating to people because they're always looking for what could go wrong. And we aren't going to talk about subtypes in this episode, but I want to say that subtypes are really important, whether you're a social, sexual, or self-preservation. Those instincts, as they're blended through each of these personality types, really informs you on a much more finer level. And with 6s, they're famous for those 3 subtypes are the biggest differences between them. For whatever reason, we don't even know. It's like maybe the intensity of the fear, the way it's translated through the instincts, each of them are very different. And just as one brief example, traditionally they were called the loyalist, but really that's just the social 6. The social 6 will be loyal to authority. It's all about the authority relationship with the 6. The 6 is going to be like, I'm afraid of authority. I really need to find someone who's going to be able to, I can trust. It's always the trust test with the 6s who are really in fear, projecting fear. And that social 6 is, hey, I can align with authority by being dutiful and really following. But the self-preservation 6, very different. A warmer 6, more like a bunny rabbit type of 6. And then that sexual 6 brings an intensity, almost seems like an 8 a little bit, whereas that social 6 seemed like a 1 in trying to be, and so you can see some of the complexity of that right there. Finally, the 7 head type, the enthusiast, they are still a head type. They are underdoing fear by running away from it. They're very future oriented. They're thinking in creative possibilities, and it's fun to think. And they might be very sophisticated, very intelligent people, and very optimistic, but they don't like the bad news. So they're so know if you've ever had a 7 in your life, man, when that 7 casts their intensity and energy on you, you feel like this is such an interesting person. And oh my gosh, are we going to have some fun? And then after you have the fun and their energy's a little waned and they turn their attention off of you, you're like, where did you go? I thought we were best friends. And now you're off to the next thing. So they're often, and just a last thought, they're often looking for that exit strategy, whether it's in their relationships, maybe hard for them to commit because they're thinking of the next thing and the next, or jobs, often what's next, or just lots of hobbies. So just because it's, hey, let's keep looking at the shiny new object and what's interesting. And that's how they come by being known as the enthusiast. Whew. So how was that run through?
I love it. I love it, love it, love it. It was
Did that
amazing.
help?
Oh, definitely. 100%.
Okay. Matt, what was that question you were having? Did you get back to that?
No, I think this is a good explanation because I wanted
Okay.
the audience member to understand like what the Enneagram was and what the type was, because once they understand that, then only we can proceed to understand what the benefits of that is, right? Because we want to be able to educate audience, because this is something that most people don't know about. It's very useful, right? So that was great. Thank you for that. The next question that I'm going to ask is this, that Chad, this was very helpful. Obviously, as I'm listening to this, and I was brought back to years ago when I first took the test, which is that when I start taking it, and for those maybe who are listening to it, they may also felt it, they see parts of themselves in the different types, whether it be the gut or the heart. How do you, as an expert, help guide someone who feels like maybe I'm this, maybe I'm that? For those who are taking the test that at home after listening to this, what are some guidelines do you have?
Ooh, it's hard for me. I think it's sometimes it's so close up and I'm so in it. I think because there's like a both and to my answer. And it's on the one hand, I've come all the way kind of full circle to saying we all have a tendency to be able to have all of these things within us. And so maybe sometimes we do over index on being able to just find this one type is you. And yet, with that said, in the end, you are a personality construct. You did develop one in early childhood. And so that's when you're taking that test, you're not just thinking about recency bias. And even if you've done a lot of growth, you're still within that personality construct that you formed, let's say, for at an early age, and it's always been a part of you. And your growth work is going to be recognizing it and aspiring to be on the more of what we would say is the high side, the healthier side of being in that construct. Because as much as we want to say that we're going to free ourselves from it, it's a lifetime's worth of work and it's humbling work. And we're gonna have to, at least it can bring awareness though of where are the points of work to be done if we're courageous enough to want to loosen the grip that it has on us. In the first place, you have to have an ego construct that is strong enough. Some people they haven't lived enough. They were traumatized enough in life that they actually really don't have a strong, clear personality construct. But for the vast majority of us, you do have one. It is identifiable with some self-observation and reading some knowledge. And then I think that's where some of your growth work can be done. And you hear a lot about with the Enneagram, you hear about wings and you hear about arrows. And those are directions for how to use the Enneagram in an informed way to grow, or at least we could just use it lightly. It's just to say to loosen the hold of ego that is in control. And that's one of the things that really does take some work. It's to realize who's really in charge. The ego for a while has probably really served you well, whatever your type, however it's worked out, whether you were a 9, 4, 5, 7. It's in certain ways it's worked for you, and that's why you've done it. And yet, at a certain point in life, usually around midlife, when you whatever it is, you become a parent, or you have a big setback or a failure, or you're under some different kinds of stress, and you realize this isn't working for me in the same way. And yet now it's in control. right? Because it's more in control than you realize it is. And so this conscious work is to be able to go, okay, whoa, I'm seeing it in play now. What do I want to do about it? And your neighboring styles, your wings, the two types on either side of your type have something to teach you. And so there's this wisdom in the arrangement of how each style is nested next to each other. And then when you want to do more advanced work, you can work with those arrows that we see all over the Enneagram. And for some, it's really interesting to really look at the symbol and consider what. So this is why, like, also, besides just wanting to learn about other people, like when you listen and learn about the Enneagram, you're not just listening for that one type that is your type, right? You're listening for, there's at least 5 points. Your type, your 2 neighboring styles, your wings, and your 2 arrows. So of the 9 types, there's at least 5 that if you're thoroughly understanding like the high side and the low side of them, then you can more intentionally work towards being in them or recognize when you're in there, either on the high or the low side. It's endlessly fascinating to think about, to go back to be like, oh, as a 7, I have an arrow to 1. And maybe I had a difficult parent who was 1. And so now I have a bit of a shadow side with 1. Maybe I only go to my 1 when I'm like in stress. And so I'm going to the low side of 1. And so when you can begin to see some of that stuff, boy, does it help in growth work and personal development work. Whereas your typical typology, it doesn't work this way. It's great to know about your Enneagram and not your Myers-Briggs or your Strength Finders or your DISC assessment. And there is value in how they describe us, but there is something this is why I've just been like fascinated by the Enneagram, because it brings in these motivations that explain some of our behaviors. And then there's this like directional path for how to work with it if you want to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's exactly where we're at, because we want to know who we are and we want to know why we are the way we are. And then we want to know how to utilize that knowledge to become the best version of ourselves, the next version of ourselves. And the tool, as you described it, is a great beginning place to be able to get started with that. Obviously, there are higher level things, and as you explained. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
I am someone who's listening to this. I'm an entrepreneur. I have now taken the quiz. I've read about this. I'm starting to understand a little bit more about myself. And I'm wanting to learn how I can apply this into my real life. One of the things that entrepreneurs deal with a lot, things like imposter syndrome or burnout. There are 2 completely different sides. At the very beginning, sometimes there's imposter syndrome, even throughout the journey, but burnout is something that happens a lot. And both of these things are a combination of logical, physical, and emotional states. So how can we utilize the Enneagram tool to navigate ourselves through these emotional states and perhaps become a little bit better version of ourselves?
Such a really great question. And I guess to answer it from some breadth, since we don't have a specific type we're talking about, but we would understand the functioning of the patterns of our type so that we could even know how are we being predisposed to being in burnout. Because what burnout is basically an experience of being under a chronic stress of one kind or another. And so we tend to point outward and say, the chronic stress I'm experiencing is because of this toxic person or this workplace or these things that I'm having to do. And the self-understanding begins to identify, how do you participate in those things? What are the stories that you tend to tell yourself? What are the beliefs that you often have? And it's different for a 1 as opposed to a 6 or a 3 or whatever. And that's just about burnout. And then I'm thinking of how to respond to the idea of imposter syndrome. It really depends on my type. If I'm feeling like I'm an imposter and I am a heart type, let's just take it as a 2, 3, or 4, then maybe I would have insight into, am I just constantly shape shifting to please my audience? and I'm not actually really owning who I truly am. Who am I if I'm not shape shifting to please my audience and be some ideal version of what I expect others expect from me? As opposed to like me, a head type would have a different relationship to imposter syndrome. And so I think so. And also, if you're stepping into courage, how you would begin to ascertain, do I know am needing to step into authentic courage that is integrating things that I've avoided that is really the way forward and it's growth for me, as opposed to just thinking this is hard, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because without as much insight into the self, into what's going on, we're much more likely to keep making very similar mistakes. And for thousands of years, the great philosophers of the world have said, start with yourself. If you want to change your reality, know thyself is the sum total of philosophy, according to Socrates. And it's even if you're in a family dynamic and you want to change the dynamics of the family, internal family systems, Bowen theory, it's start with you. Don't go to the identified patient or the victim or the persecutor or the savior. Start with yourself. How can you, by doing your work and thinking of your contribution to the collective, how can you pull out of that game? How can you just you, nobody else, shift the dynamic? And I think that's the ultimate. It's not selfish to do self work. In fact, I think it's the second mountain. We climb that first mountain and we develop the ego construct, and then something happens and we go into that valley. What do we do with it? Do we choose to just keep repeating those patterns of that first mountain? So many do. Or do we decide, I want to engage in a little bit more of an interesting life? I know that it won't always necessarily be easy, but I'm going to address some things. And of course, that's what I encourage people to do. I think it leads to a more fulfilled life and one in which you can take on the mantle of that hero's journey and you come back a little bit more whole and complete. And then you can share and give the bounty with your tribe and your collective.
Yeah. No, I love it. What you just said is so deep and profound. And as I'm thinking about it, when it comes to burnout, when it comes to imposter syndrome, when it comes to inability to take certain actions that we know we ought to be taking, the common narratives for sometimes who are unable to do it is that they just can't muscle through it. And that's what you talked about, as in that not everybody can just always push themselves through it, muscling through the task. Therefore, they are stuck in that pattern of repeating the same thing over and over again, wondering why they are unable to get it. So would you say there are some subconscious blocks that are in place there and that is stopping them from progressing? And if that's the case, how could the Enneagram then help them uncover those subconscious blocks so that they can finally proceed and not have to out muscle through and let it just flow through them?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And Parker Palmer, he's in his mid 80s now. He wrote Let Your Life Speak and a number of wonderful books. And he says that burnout is giving of something with that is not mine to give. And so it's that idea of muscling through. It's not from a sustained, soulful, authentic source. It's because I should, or culture tells me to, or I'm living out a pattern of what others, I think my parents want of me, or I'm reacting against my parents and just trying to do the opposite. But either way, it's in relationship to the parent. Overall, I'll answer your question this way, Mark, by saying that the Enneagram can help us address with at first with compassion. And I think there's a paradox where like it's this analogy of the rose and the sword, right? So we need the rose of compassion with ourselves when we're first beginning to engage in this ego work, because if we have judgment and we have self-condemnation and shame, that's going to shut us down right at the gateway before we even get started. So we have to be able to truly just be deeply self-compassionate, maybe even just laugh at ourselves. This is all folly, right? We're all flawed and this isn't going to last very long anyway. So lighten up, right? And then there are times to be like the sword of truth with yourself when the time comes. So with all of that said, I think that one of the biggest teachings that we should all really listen to from Carl Jung is this idea of the shadow side. And he just constantly talked about it. And the shadow is not evil. And the shadow is something that we've put into the shadows because somebody or ourselves, for whatever reason, thought that it wasn't as valuable or important, or it was something to be pushed down. And then we shine a light on this virtuous side that we want everyone to see. And the more we try to be good and the more we try to shine this big bright light on ourselves, the bigger the shadow. And so this isn't about trying to be good. This is about trying to be more integrated and trying to be more whole. And so you do it by going in and doing the hard. It is hard to shine a light on places within our psyche structures that we've always denied, ignored, repressed, thought was bad. And so that's where, like, when you begin to understand your archetype, then you can understand not only the highs, but almost what's the opposite. So if a 4 loves being special and extraordinary, and what's the most amazing way I can be, what's the opposite of that? It would be to be ordinary. It'd be to be dull. It'd be to be okay with doing the mundane. And what do you learn from that? Because that's probably in your shadow. So it can be as simple as this opposite of your main characteristics. A final illustration that I would share about this idea of the shadow side is I'm writing a book and I'm reading some of these powerful literature moments and I'm reading Dante's Inferno. And so Virgil accompanies him at the beginning of he finds himself in the dark wood of error, literally in midlife. Right. So that's where it all begins. He begins the journey in the dark wood of error. That's us in personality burning out. And reason or wisdom, Virgil comes to his aid to say, look, I can get you out of this. I can accompany you. And they come up to, early on, the door of hell. And that famous sign above it that's insane, abandon hope, all who enter here. And there's this moment where Dante's at Virgil is, do we need to go through Hades? And Virgil's, we got to go. And then they do. And I now interpret that and understand that as being like Dante is effectively asking, is there another way? Do I have to do this hard work? Can I be exonerated in some way from having to go through hell? And we all want that. We all want to be exonerated from having to do the difficult work. And the message is, you gotta go through hell, right? That famous thing that Robert Frost, the only way out is through.
It really gave me goosebumps as you said it, because I read the Dante's Inferno like a long time ago, and I don't remember much other than the 7 layers of hell and his experience through it. And when you brought it back, it's something that we talk about on a daily basis. There is no shortcut to success, right? And that's exactly what he's laying out years and years ago in a very different context. And I never interpreted that until you brought it up. So thank you for bringing that up, because yes, that is exactly what is happening. I'm writing a new book. Tell us about this new book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's called The Missing Conversation, Strengthening the 3 Most Important Relationships in Your Life. And it's this idea of what's the missing conversation that you should be having within yourself? What's a missing conversation possibly with your intimate, important other? And then what are maybe missing conversations with you in the workplace dynamics and with the others on your team? And yeah, it's because I'm always seeing what's missing, but I do think that we need to be asking ourselves questions, because what's a good conversation asks you good questions. And maybe there are missing conversations that you should be having that would lead to deeper, more mature integrated growth.
Yeah, this speaks to me in so many ways. Peak performance perspective, we talk about health, wealth, and relationships. The depth of a relationship really depends on the type of conversation, the breadth of the conversation that one can have. And whether it be relationship with self or relationship with others, like you mentioned, it's the deep questions that either help us find more about ourselves or get in touch another part of us through a conversation with someone else. So I can't wait for this book to be out. Obviously, you are a wealth of knowledge. I could literally talk to you for 8 hours straight and not get tired of it, because it's just fascinating to hear you explain these things. For those who are listening to this, who want to work with you more, how can they get in touch with you?
You can find me at chadprevost.com. And right now, I still have an email with Big Self School, chad@bigselfschool.com. It's my wife and I have worked on a business together for a few years, and we put together a lot of different teachings and trainings. But yeah, I've got some availability as a coach. My book, Shock Point, The Enneagram and Burnout and Stress, is available wherever you can find books. And I would thanks for the opportunity to share that, Mark. I would say that for your audience, you don't have to take a test to be able to identify your type. And even then, it might not always be accurate. There are some good free ones now. Some of them are paid, and you can do a typing interview. I do those. But I would say some really good books is like The Complete Enneagram by Beatrice Chestnut. She published that in 2013, but that is an awfully good, it's a big one. It's almost, you got to use that as a reference point. In fact, look at it. It's right here. I didn't even admit The Complete Enneagram by Beatrice Chestnut. And then they've got The Guide to Waking Up, which is even easier to read. It's more recent. Uranio Pius contributed on that one. There are so many books on the Enneagram right now, though. If you wanted a real Christian kind of spiritual, Richard Rohr, he wrote one a number of years ago. Richard Rohr is wonderful and amazing. And that is a deep, powerful, great Enneagram book. There's really a whole mess, but you can read a friendly, funny one is Ian Morgan Crone's The Road Back to You. That's a popular one, and a lot of people enjoy because he's funny as well. So those are some ideas. But of course, the Enneagram and Burnout and Stress as well. And through that lens, I also do talk about the subtypes, the instincts and the subtypes. So you can really try to fine tune that if you checked out that book.
From the beginning of time, man has been trying to answer the question, who am I and why I'm here? And essentially what you're offering through your services, through your books, through your gracious time appearing in podcasts like that, are tools and perspectives that can perhaps help someone understand who they really are, why are they that way, what makes them tick, and how they can get better. Thank you so much for appearing on the show, giving us your knowledge, giving us your time, making the lives of everybody listening to this better. It was a pleasure having you here.